In Glasgow, 2 players, and exactly 2 players, are trying to score the most amount of victory points within a more or less undetermined number of rounds. And when I say rounds, this time it's for real, as we are actually moving our little player figures around a circle, also known as the river. And as we are building this circle differently each time we are playing this and are not using all of the so-called contract tiles in every game, 2 are always left out, poor them, the game is quite replayable and definitely more on the tactical side. Another randomizer are the buildings, as you can never be sure when particular buildings make their appearance. Or maybe they never appear at all. The actual gameplay is quite simple. The player who is behind will move their pawn to any available space within the circle. And available means either no one else is there, or it's an architect tile where both of the players can be at the same time. I mean, we all know that architects know how to throw a party. Of course, you're also not allowed to land on the same space you started from. Would feel rather broken. After your movement, you either use the benefits of a contract tile, that's at scrapping some resources such as bricks, steel or gold. And as it's all about Scotland after all, here we have the mandatory whiskey barrel. Strangely enough, the game comes exactly with 1. And players even need to share this, and sometimes it never shows at all, especially when the proper contract tile was one of the set tiles that weren't allowed to play, like this one here. After you have gathered some resources, it's now time to build the city of Glasgow by moving to an architect and put a building into the middle of the circle. And obviously you have to pay the resources that are printed on it. Quite simple, right? When you have enough gold or use the contract before that allows you to build twice for free, you can do so. Even a 3rd time, if you're able to pay, of course. Buildings will score you your actual victory points depending on their types. Parks, for example, will give you more points the more parks you have at the end of the game, whereas tenements want to be next to tenements to maximize their score, and train stations want you to have certain types of other buildings in the city of Glasgow. Most buildings also give you some basic points, but don't rely on those. You really want the synergies to score big. Let's not forget about factories, which are somewhat different, as those are usually activated by placing other buildings in the same row or column. In most cases, those give you different resources. But some of them also allow you to do crazy stuff, like changing the buildings of a certain architect, for example, of your choice in that case, either because you are desperately looking for a specific building on your own, or you want to make sure your opponent doesn't get his thick spark, which would score him 36 points at the end of the game. Also quite different kind of contract tiles available, as not all simply give you resources, which would be quite boring anyway. No, some allow you to trade resources, yeah, also that is not really quite fancy, I agree, but some also allow you to alter the offer of a specific architect or activates the factories of certain rows and columns, like this one here. The game ends when a player places the 20th building in the center of the circle by, let's call it, Glasgow. And you always build a 4x5 or a 5x4 grid, which is getting determined throughout the game, depending on how the players place their buildings here on the board. The game ends immediately once the final building was placed. No more same amount of turns kind of stuff. Building is placed, game is over. Live with it. Then you do the usual scoring and determine a winner. Nothing crazy going on here, as all the points should be more or less obvious at this point in time. There shouldn't be really any surprises at all. Glasgow is an interesting 2-player game that plays really fast. It's relatively easy to learn, but also not that difficult to master. Some choices are crystal clear, sometimes you have to rely a little bit on your luck, and often your opponent takes exactly the action or tile you wanted to move to, which is a good thing in my book if you like some interaction in your games. Replayability is relatively high, as the board will look different every time you play, so usually you have to adapt your strategy accordingly, which for me is also a good thing, as I don't like games that are too plannable. I certainly enjoyed, but take it with a pinch of salt as usual.